a few weeks. So. Oh, we're recording. So official. I wonder where Naomi is.
I hope she hasn't been affected by bad weather or anything. It's been a lot of storms. All right, should we get started, do you think, Mandy?
Let's. Oh, the first few slides, she's our gal. Well, most of our conversation stems from her. So let's see. I don't know. I'm hesitant to start without her, but I want to. I don't want to. I want to maximize everyone's time. But
yes, I agree. All right, here we go. So welcome, everyone.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Mandy.
Well, this is the part where we introduce all three of ourselves, but Naomi is missing. If you haven't read her book, Refraction, you should. We just did it for a book club at my school, and it's pretty great. She's hopefully going to join us soon. She is pretty knowledgeable about YA and mental health, and hopefully she'll be here soon to tell you why exactly. And then we've got Dr. Heidi Jenkins, and then I am Mandy McDonald. I am the secondary librarian at North Rock Creek Middle and High School. And this is my first full year being a librarian, and I feel like I'm gypped because of COVID and because I'm going on maternity leave soon, but that's fine. Books will still be in kids' hands, and that's fine. I'm super excited about this session because I feel like I learned while doing these things that we're about to tell you about how to better reach some of my students and how to recommend things in the collection a little bit better. So I'll let Heidi introduce herself, though.
Okay, hi, I am Dr. Heidi Jenkins. I am the librarian at Bixby High School, which is south of Tulsa. We're a growing 6A district, and I've been there for quite a while. And I became interested in mental health in young adult literature through a lot of interactions with students who either themselves are working through a diagnosis, coming to diagnosis, or they have parents or good friends who have issues that are starting to be addressed or have been addressed. So I think it's very, very, very important, especially during this time, that we continue to have conversations among ourselves as librarians, among our colleagues, and with our patrons regarding mental health. And sometimes the less direct approach of a story of someone else really works for someone rather than maybe reading a nonfiction, although we are going to talk about a few nonfiction as well. So, okay. Are you handling the slide? There we go, Mandy.
Yes, I've got the button. If you don't have any questions while we're talking, go ahead and just put those in the chat, and we will come back to those at the end. Otherwise, we could be here for hours, which I'm sure we would all enjoy. But again, want to maximize our time here. So I love this quote, and this comes from the ALA website. Bibliotherapy, finally it has a name for exactly the best part of being a YA librarian. This idea that books connect with kids. I know we use the phrase mirrors and windows often, but it has an even cooler name, and that's bibliotherapy. This idea that we can use literature to not only help students, but for them to advocate for themselves. If you want more information and way many more resources than we're going to give you today, you can click on the link that's available on those slides. Actually, no, it's not available on those slides. There's a Wakelet, I think, that's posted as one of your resources. And there's a full list of all of the outside links and sources that we talk about today. So you can go check that out for more information about this bigger concept of bibliotherapy. But for today, we're going to focus just on the mental health aspect of it.
And Mandy and I are both librarians, so we often refer to patrons as students. So we apologize for that, but that's kind of, our lived experience. So please forgive us for that.
Yeah, thank you. I never catch myself doing that. So. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is just some basic background of why this is so important. I think in general, we know that mental health is something that greatly affects our students, but we don't always know specifically how or what that looks like. And so we're going to go a little bit over that. And Naomi is
Hi.
here.
I am so sorry. I thought I had it in my calendar as 1 o'clock, you guys. I'm so sorry.
Oh no.
But I'm here.
Well, why don't you introduce yourself, and then I think that you might be next.
Okay. I'm glad I got here in time.
Yes.
Hi, everybody. I'm so sorry again that I'm late. I'm Amanda. I'm really glad that you emailed me because I was like, oh my gosh. So I am Naomi Hughes. I'm an author. I write young adult sci-fi and fantasy. And these are my books here. Get them in front of the webcam. Which one? Refraction was actually on the Sequoia list this year, which I am super excited about. Both of them feature mental health elements, panic disorder for afterimage, and OCD for refraction, both of which I have. So I like representing those so that my readers who have mental health issues can see themselves as the heroes in stories, and not in a way where they need to be fixed in order to have awesome time travel adventures or slay dragons or stuff like that. So I have a lot of personal investment in this subject, and I'm really happy to be here doing it with you guys.
All right.
Naomi, you have control now of the slides.
Oh, I do?
So
okay.
I think you do.
Sorry. Should I give it back?
Okay.
Okay, let's see. Okay, let me, I'm sorry, I'm so disorganized. I had this all planned out, and then I just got back from ordering lunch, so let me pull up my shared screen real quick.
So Naomi is going to give us a few statistics regarding mental health and young adults and teens. And if you look at this list that we have here, we're talking about depression, anxiety, substance abuse, ADHD, psychosis. And this comes from a study that is posted on polaristeen.com. I also added some other disorders that tend to manifest themselves during the teen years, or if they're not actually manifesting at that time, they may have manifested when they were younger, but sometimes don't get diagnosed until later. But OCD, eating disorders, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. Both schizophrenia and bipolar can be very difficult to diagnose because you have to see a pattern of the depression and mania or hypomania and or schizophrenic behaviors. They don't necessarily correlate with one another. They're separate disorders. Bipolar disorder can often get misdiagnosed as depression or anxiety. And so we have to be careful with medications that are suggested. So if a student is talking to you or a young adult or any age patron is talking to you about any sort of diagnosis that they've received, it's important to be aware that they have probably experienced a lot before they got to that point. Okay, so Naomi, I'll let you jump in now.
Yeah, absolutely. You pretty much covered most of the the things for this slide. My best friend actually was just recently diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and she's 30. And for me, I was diagnosed with OCD at 28, and both of us have had symptoms of these mental health issues since we were, early teens. And that's actually really typical. For OCD, the usual gap between when treatment or between when symptoms start and when they're properly diagnosed and treated is 17 years. And that's terrible. That's a really long time to live without hope or treatment, or even sometimes knowledge that you're not the only person with this weird thing going on in your head. And that's one reason why I think it's so important to represent these issues in young adult fiction. And especially to represent a wide range of them. When I was a teenager, we didn't have hardly any of these represented in books, which is part of the reason why it took so long for me to be diagnosed. Now, fortunately, we do have more, but we still need a wider range. And let me pull up this next slide here, because I think that talks more about different types here. Let's see here. Yeah, so not just the mental health issue that that students have, that it can also lead to suicide. So there's a lot at stake to helping students feel not alone and to helping patrons feel not alone. It says suicide's the third leading cause of death in youth ages 10 to 24, and that 90% of those who died by suicide had an underlying mental illness. And as some of the studies that we looked up have shown, the rates of mental illness have actually increased in the last decade. Part of that is probably because we're getting better at diagnosing and recognizing the symptoms, which is great. We can't treat something that we can't see or can't diagnose. But part of it is also because the world's a lot harder for teens, I think, than it was when even I was a teenager. There's a lot more choices. The world feels a lot bigger. Stakes feel a lot higher. The internet has added a lot of new dimensions for kids to experience things that we wouldn't have experienced at that age. And all of that can definitely add to some trauma that can lead to mental illness, or can even bring out some things that were already there due to genetics that might not have otherwise have been quite so bad or quite so triggered. Heidi, was there anything you wanted to add to this slide?
No, just how we are seeing increases in numbers, and I think that with our current circumstances, we're going to continue to see even more increases. There's been discussion by the CDC about whether or not students should return to school, and places should be open to the public because of the effect on their mental health. And so I foresee this being a big conversation this entire fall and winter, and however long this situation lasts. On the one hand, with social media outlets, we're more connected than ever, but on the other hand, we're so isolated. And I think that trying to help people, adults and teens, through these situations with stories can really be beneficial. And so I think we need to continue to read ourselves what's coming out, which is part of why we have our bibliography for you, so that we can pass that information along to others. Okay.
Okay. So here on this slide, we wanted to talk a little bit about why the having a wide selection of mental health representation is really important in young adult literature, and also kind of some different factors of things to consider as you decide what to add, what type of books to add to your collection. So some things that I think are really important is to look for own voices books. You might have seen this hashtag on Twitter and Facebook. Basically, it means that the author has the same minority status or mental health issue or disability that they are writing about in their book. So for me, Refraction is own voices for OCD, because I also have OCD and I represented that in my main character, Marty. These types of books I feel can give a really good insight to what it's like, because the author really knows what they're talking about because they've experienced it themselves. And sometimes they can show some different facets of that other people just might not get. And also there are some authors who may mean well, but they don't necessarily have that mental health issue, and they perhaps didn't do as much research as they should have. And the thing is, that doesn't just end up as a minor thing. Misrepresentation, it can be pretty serious. It can make teens and patrons feel more alone. There are some bad tropes out there, such as the crazy evil villain whose craziness somehow made him evil, which is not a real thing. But portraying it as if it is something that could happen in real life can hurt, like physically hurt real life people, because it can lead to more bullying and less understanding and less empathy. And those are the opposite of the things that we're looking for. Heidi, I think you also wanted to mention about parental views of parents who have. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. We do tend to, as a group of presenters here, we do really appreciate the own voices messages that we found in some of our reading. But I also wanted to point out that sometimes titles written by loved ones can be very impactful as well, especially when, like Neil Schusterman wrote a book with his son regarding his schizophrenia. And there's a series, well, not really a series, but there's 2 books on an eating disorder that one is written by the mother and one is written by the daughter who was going through it. And so sometimes it may not be the actual person has experienced it, but someone close to a person has experienced it, and they can sometimes see what the other person doesn't see. Often with mental illness, part of the reason that the person who's suffering doesn't realize that not everybody feels this way is because it feels logical to them. They feel that, of course, this is the way the world is. And when the parent or the best friend or the teacher has actually viewed this and experienced this with the person, sometimes they have a good message that we can learn a lot from as well, because they see how it's not logical, some of the things that the person is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. A good way to if you don't have experience with a certain mental health element, a good way to check and see if a book represents that element well is to look at the reviews. Because usually, as a rule, if there are people who have that condition who have reviewed that book and think it represents it well, that's a pretty good sign that it has good representation. And also, another note is, of course, mental health is not a monolith. Even in just OCD, my experience is vastly different from someone else's experience, and their experience is completely different, because mental health and mental illness is very personalized. And it manifests in a lot of different ways for any given illness, not even to mention from different kinds of illnesses. So we definitely want to keep that in mind, that in any one book, one person might say this is great representation, and another one might say, this isn't how it looks for me. So that can also be a good topic to discuss with students. If that's a required reading, you could ask them what they think might represent it well and not. That could be an interesting thing to look into. And let's see here. Oh, and we also wanted to look at having post-diagnosis stories as well as journey to diagnosis stories. A lot of times what I see in my reading is the journey to diagnosis stories, and that's the plot, and especially in contemporary books that have mental health representation. It starts out with the protagonist not really knowing what's going on, and then their symptoms get progressively worse, and then at the end they get their diagnosis and figure out what's going on. And that's the point at which the story usually ends. But I also think it's really important to show life beyond that initial diagnosis, because diagnosis usually happens at once, at one point in your life. And it's certainly a very important process. And it can take a while to kind of get through that process. But post-diagnosis, the journey through your mental health issue, that lasts a lifetime. And teens and kids especially need to see that hope that they can live a worthwhile and meaningful life after diagnosis. And they need to kind of get some insight to what that might look like in order to have that hope. They can't have hope necessarily for themselves for something that they don't know exists. So I think that's a particularly important thing to show. And also to have across genres. We see a lot of contemporary mental health representation, which is awesome. I have a personal note here. I got to meet John Green once, and he's fantastic, and I highly recommend his books. He wrote Turtles All the Way Down, which features OCD and is very well written. It's also really important to have some genre fiction with good mental health representation, because for me, I love sci-fi and fantasy, and a lot of times that has less representation than contemporary seems to have. But some kids, that's all they read. They love genre fiction, and if they don't see themselves in whatever genre they like to read, then they don't have the opportunity that other kids might have to see themselves in their books. Heidi, did you want to talk about the peer group?
Yes, thank you. Just real quick, I want to jump on the to diagnose and post-diagnosis stories. You'll also find stories where the protagonist has been diagnosed and is being possibly medicated, possibly therapy. And it's interesting when they've already been diagnosed and they go through a stopping their medication. That can be very informative for people to read, because the medications can be very difficult to find a cocktail that works. And so it can help students and young adults and even parents see that it's not a one-stop shop when they go into treatment. And so I also wanted to mention, it falls in our post-diagnosis, but I think that when it's post-diagnosis and they don't accept the diagnosis or they don't accept the treatment, that can be very informative as well. But another thing I wanted to mention was that when you're reading these books and you're reading the reviews for books like this, we want to look at how the community of the protagonist treats their illness, okay? You're going to have people reading books from all kinds of backgrounds. And so one person may really relate to where the parent doesn't agree that they have a mental illness or that they need treatment, where another person is going to relate better to a story where the parents are very supportive. And so looking at the community that surrounds the protagonist and having some variety there as well is really important, so that, again, as Naomi was pointing out, the person doesn't feel they're in it alone. And they can see that even if they're not getting a lot of support from their particular peer group, let's say, that maybe a change in peer group is going to help them. Maybe the transition from high school to college. Or if their parents are not very supportive, that doesn't mean that no adult will support them, that they may find, a friend's mother supportive, a school counselor supportive, a librarian supportive. And so just a variety of works that show a lot of different perspectives is really important.
Yeah, and I also wanted to jump on that a little bit. Heidi, you were talking about treatment, medication, and therapy, and I also wanted to make sure that we make the point that that's really important to find books that show that in a positive light, because there's so much stigma, particularly around mental health medication. And luckily to a somewhat lesser degree now, also there's a stigma around therapy. Those are the two things that literally save lives in mental illness cases. So it's really important, I think, to show those in a positive light and how much they can help people. Mandy, I think that you are up for the next one here.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about triggering and outing concerns, but this is something that, as we're addressing this issue with teen readers, we don't want to give them titles that could immediately cause them harm emotionally. So we want to avoid wording in titles in general that could out them or trigger something. But we'll talk about that a little bit more as we dive into the rubric for selection. I think all of you have access to the rubric. It's a cute little bookmark, because what librarian doesn't like a bookmark? So again, we've talked about why this is such a prevalent thing with our teen readers, and how we can address it. But if you're like me and you're a librarian / English teacher and not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and only like this much, education on that, I don't know where to start. So this rubric has kind of the basic things that we just talked about, and we'll kind of flesh out how you can use that. But that rubric is just a reminder for us, as we're making our collection and selecting materials, how we can incorporate those ideas and find new texts for our collection. So here in your Wakelet, you've got a link to everydayhealth.com that has kind of a list of things, ideas and topics that might be triggering to our readers. Again, like I said, we don't want to put a book in a student or patron's hand and then have their emotional problems and mental health issues on display for everyone watching them read it. So we need to be sensitive, first of all, in even recommending titles to students and patrons sometimes, but we also need to be sensitive about what the wording is and what the content is. So again, I have very basic knowledge of very basic mental health issues that my personal students face, but that site has been pretty helpful for me to be in that mindset of, okay, what's on this cover or the words that are on the first few pages could be harmful to my students. And so either I want to avoid that or I want to have a conversation about that with my students. But again, like Heidi said, that takes us reading and making sure that we know what is in the content of that book before we hand it off to them.
Naomi, were you going to speak about triggering with the John Green book?
Yes, let me go back here. Yeah, so like I said, I adore John Green. He's a fantastic person and writer. When I started Turtles All the Way Down, I actually could not get further than a couple of chapters into it, because it represented OCD so well. And in particular, it represented the type of OCD that I have, which is pure O, where it is mostly mental compulsions. Things like mentally counting or trying to make sure that you're thinking good thoughts all the time. And the main character was just so well written, and I could tell that John really knew what he was talking about because of that. But yeah, it was so triggering. I had to stop reading it. And so I think it's important to remember that when you're recommending titles to patrons and in picking which books to read in class. And to be careful not to, as Mandy, I think, said, not to accidentally diagnose students or allow them to diagnose each other. Because that can, it can be helpful sometimes, but more often it can lead to accidental harm, unfortunately. Okay.
So we were going to go over a few nonfiction resources as well to help us with our trigger identification and authenticity of representation. If we know a little bit more about some of these disorders, we can better assess books, better review them ourselves, excuse me, before we recommend them to students or to young adults. So the kind of Bible of diagnoses is the DSM-5, which stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, last updated by the American Psychiatric Association in 2013. And there are things do change over time in diagnosis. And so I wouldn't say that you would purchase this and put this on your shelf, but if you want a definitive answer to what sort of characteristics occur where a person would be diagnosed with this is the place to look. Okay.
The next resource is the Kelty Mental Health Resource Library, and that's on your Wakelet as well. It's actually out of Canada, and it has honestly an overwhelming selection of resources, from posters to just informational blurbs and websites about specific mental health issues and illnesses. And I found it to be helpful, especially if a student came back after reading something that may have I'm using the word incorrectly, not triggered as in upset them, but maybe got them thinking about their own mental health. I feel like I would feel comfortable going to this resource and finding things for myself and for the student to help them sort through that. But as I'm making my selection and I want to be authentic, there's a lot of things, like I said, I don't know. And so this might be a little bit overwhelming because, like I said, it's pages and pages and pages of resources, but it could help us flesh out a little bit more of some of those things in a less psychiatric way, a more approachable way for the common librarian.
Yeah, and also I wanted to mention the illness-specific sources. They are a really good way to learn about if you have a specific type of mental illness that you want to get more information about. Look up there's usually a foundation, such as the International OCD Foundation has tons of amazing and in-depth resources. So usually you can find that with just like a quick Google. And also real fast, I see that Jason Gonzalez asked a question about Turtles All the Way Down and whether that is a book that I would recommend to a teen who has OCD. Well, like I said earlier, it's really not a monolith. OCD is not the same for everyone at all. So while I felt triggered reading Turtles All the Way Down, someone who has a different type of OCD, such as like their compulsion is counting, or they have harm OCD where they're afraid that they might accidentally go crazy and hurt someone that they love. Turtles All the Way Down might not be triggering at all to them because it represents it in a slightly different way. We all have completely different experiences. So one of the things that I would recommend is giving a teen choices. Like if you're going to read OCD books for a particular week in class, maybe give teens the option of Turtles All the Way Down, or maybe a sci-fi or fantasy novel that also represents OCD authentically, but in a way where it's not the main focus of the plot, where it doesn't feel quite as heavy. So I think choices are a really good option to have when you're considering whether a title might be triggery or not, because sometimes we don't even know what's going to trigger us until it triggers us. So giving options is a really good way to deal with that.
Okay, so we had a couple other things on the last slide, looking at tidal wave from Follett and what reviewers suggest regarding titles. And also the website A Novel Mind has title suggestions in different categories. Okay. Additional resources that may be informative. When you are reading the book itself, there may be resources suggested within the book that may also be beneficial. I found when I read OCD Daniel, the author has OCD and had a similar experience to the 13-year-old protagonist. And he mentions in the back of the book the website that Naomi just talked about from the OCD Foundation. So I look at those, and then I also talk to other professionals about resources, other librarians, and other people in my building where I work, and other high school teachers, counselors, etc. I find that we've gone through a few deaths in our school since I've been there, both of faculty and of students. And so we often discuss what sort of resources we want to maybe increase during a particular time. So a depression that is associated with grief. I want to talk with my school counselor, maybe go onto social media to some places where professional organizations suggest works, is another good place to look for these suggestions. And so see works by other librarians who serve youth. I've got a couple here. They're listed on the PowerPoint. So these two. They have already done some of the work of looking through, really doing a deep dive into what's available and picking what they see as currently some of the best. So, we're providing you some titles. Other books will provide you titles. And additionally, we've got a few other nonfiction that occur on our bibliography. So I think that was everything I wanted to cover there.
So we have talked a little bit about the rubric. You can read that for yourselves. We've talked a little bit about where you can get more resources to help you use the rubric. But now that we've made the selections and we've put these things on the shelves, and we're going to talk a little bit specific about schools and how to implement it there. But this can work in book clubs. It can work in public libraries as well. But we're going to talk a little bit about how do we now put those things in the hands of the people that can get them to the students. So I think, Naomi, you're going to talk about offering, well, you kind of did, but you want to elaborate a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I answered Jason's question earlier, I actually talked a little bit about what I meant to talk about on this slide anyway. So yeah, offering choice is a really good option for book clubs and for classrooms because, well, first of all, what speaks to one kid or patron might not necessarily speak to the other one. So you want to give as wide of a choice as possible so that that representation and the empathy that it brings can get through. And also with the triggering issues, giving teens especially and kids a choice in which book they would like to read for, say, an assignment would be really helpful. And another thing that we wanted to mention was that it's important to incorporate these books throughout the whole year and not just focus on them for a monthly topic or a week, mental health week, that sort of thing. Those are great opportunities to bring more focus, but these kids and these people who have mental health issues live with them all year long. So I think it's really good to make sure that they get represented as more than just a topic of the week type thing too. Anybody else had anything for this slide?
So
Okay.
now is the best part, the questions and the answers. And we have curated a list of titles spanning from middle grades to true older YA. And we're not going, you guys can read, you're librarians. So we're not going to go over that book by book, but that should be attached to your handouts for this session. If you have any questions, we are welcome. We welcome them. So if you have any questions, go ahead and drop those in the chat and we will do our best to answer those.
And while everyone is typing, I will go ahead and give you a quick preview of the annotated bibliography there. Oh, that's a really good question, Courtney. Graphic novels or comics that are representative? I unfortunately don't, that's not quite my genre, so I can't think of any right offhand. Heidi, Mandy, do you guys have any?
Well, I will say that the novel Speak by, and I'm not going to get her name right, I already apologize. I think it's Laura Halsey Anderson.
Lori Halsey Anderson, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. It recently came out in graphic novel form. And so it's discussing selective mutism after trauma. And in graphic novel, it is fantastic. I thought I was going to read 2 or 3 pages, and basically every student who came in for the next hour, I was like, whatever, because this is amazing. So I highly recommend that one. But of course, again, you want to think about who is going to be reading it. Okay, the graphic novel really kind of puts it right in the face, kind of what happened to this girl and what happens later when she comes into contact with the person who first attacked her. And nothing graphic in the sense of obscene or anything, but just it's black and white, and it's very impactful in that manner. So that is an excellent question, and we need to look further into that, but I do suggest that one, definitely.
Absolutely.
I think that, I can't remember did we make that a PDF, Heidi, when we shared it, or was it a link? Okay.
No, it's a PDF.
Okay. It's also linked in our Wakelet. So if you have any suggestions, audience, of some good titles, off the top of my head, I'm like looking over at my graphic novel section, and I know if I went over there, I could probably find something, but I'm not going to leave right now. But I'm going to go ahead and add Speak to that list. And so that's like the live list or the live bibliography is available on the Wakelet. So if we think of any later, we'll be sure and add those titles as well.
Did anybody else have any questions for us? And while we were waiting for any last possible questions, I just wanted to thank you guys for coming. There were so many. Actually more than I was expecting. I'm really excited that so many people are interested in representing mental health and in their collections. I think we've got. Go ahead.
I just want to jump in real quick and my little PSA. As some of us are returning to work and some of us have been at work, please think about what you need for self-care and make that a priority as we go into this fall. We can only help people if we are in a place that we have the emotional energy to give. And so know what you need as well. And feel free to talk with others about what they do for self-care to help their mental awareness of themselves and of people that they work with. So hopefully we will get through this pandemic soon.
Yes, school librarians, public librarians, all librarians. I want to thank you because what you do is amazing, and you are my favorite people in the world, and you have been since I was like 8 years old. But particularly now in the situation that's going on, you guys are doing amazing work. Whether you do it from home or at your facilities, I really appreciate you.
Yeah, now's the time for bibliotherapy.
Yes, definitely. Okay, I think there's no questions.
Yeah, thank you guys. You're thanking all of us, but thank you.
Yes, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Heidi, Mandy, and Naomi very much. This is a wonderful presentation. In just a few moments, I'll go ahead and close the recording. But for everyone who joined us today, just know that those resources will continue to be available to you because we got a lot of great stuff here today.
Thanks, Erin.
Thank you, Erin. And congratulations on the baby, Mandy.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
So excited for you.
I'll be here on Labor Day. It's Kismet.
Oh, wonderful. I hope you got a good lunch, Naomi.
I have to warm it up. I was walking in the door when I got Mandy's email, and I was like, oh my gosh. So it's on the table right now. That's what microwaves are for. It's fine.
Well, at 1 p.m., that's when we practiced.
Oh, that must be why I put it in wrong.
And I clicked on the link for our practice session, and I'm just sitting here waiting. Nothing's happening. I was like, oh, it says practice. So it's...
Oops.
We got here in the end.
Yes, we did. We did.
Well, should we go ahead and log off, or is there anything else we need to do before we shut down, Erin? Erin?
Maybe she's running multiple.
She could be.
She